Hi, I'm Christine Milne and I'm here with the Bob Brown Foundation, and I'm speaking with Bruce Mountain from the Victorian Energy Policy Centre in Victoria, and he's here to address a conference of economists, a national conference that's being held in Hobart. And here we are in July 2022, Bruce, and we are still arguing the point over Marinus. So the first question I want to put to you is, what have we found out in the last 6 months or so about the costs to hydro to actually even engage the idea of joining up with Marinus?
Okay. We've learned from EMO's ISP and from figures from TasHydro that they'll need to spend what they say is $2.25 billion to improve their hydro system in order to operate it essentially as a almost base load energy production exporter to Victoria.
So you're saying that quite apart from the $4 billion that is the estimated cost of the Marinus link, that Tasmanian Hydro is going to have to stump up $2.5 billion, which means that's a cost to the Tasmanian community.
Yeah, they say they'll have to stump up $2.25 billion as a capex number. I suspect the operations will add another $100 million a year. And in addition to that, you can't forget that they'll be pressured to enter into long-term offtake agreements with the wind generators, which I suspect will not be advantageous to TasHydro. So, in fact, the great advantage of hydro and Tas as a storable source of power for the NEM turns out to be far from costless. In fact, there's a very great deal of expenditure that needs to be incurred in order to make it possible.
Okay, so let's just unpack that a bit. So we've got the $2.5 billion to reconfigure the hydro and to build the pumped hydro facility and so on in order to have the energy to send across Marinus that they're promising. Then you've got the cost of $4 billion going upwards as we speak for the actual cable, and including the new transmission that will be required from the northwest coast to join up with Marinus. But then you're saying that those wind farms that are going to profit from all of this are not going to be competitive, and so the hydro is going to have to sign up power purchase agreements, which again are going to cost the Tasmanian taxpayers to subsidise these investors.
Yeah, wind in Tasmania has no economic advantage to wind elsewhere. It did at one time when the capital costs of wind was very high, and so yield was important. But two things have happened. One is the capital outlays for wind production have come down, and wind turbine technology has moved on. So you can get similar yields from lower winds. And so what we see in the contemporary wind studies is they're all much of a muchness everywhere in the NEM. So Tasmania's underlying, the myth of the energy advantage that Tas has been lost to technology change, both in energy production for the wind as well as in storage through battery technology being a cheaper technology. And we've learned that Tas doesn't have fantastic storage capability that can be costlessly used on the mainland and in Tas. In fact, it'll be a great deal of expenditure to get that resource to be useful, and a great deal of risk taken on by Hydro Tas to firm up the income for the wind farms. So I'm afraid there's no great advantage.
So what I don't understand here is why these wind farm developers would build wind in Tasmania, either with or without Marinus. Now, the Australian Energy Market Operator is saying that whether or not Marinus exists, all these new wind farms are going to be built in Tasmania. Now, I have said, you have said, others have said, how do you figure that they're going to be built in Tasmania if there's no Marinus? What's been the Australian Energy Market Operator's response to the fact that they're just saying these will happen anyway, even if they're not economic?
Yeah, they've said the TRET, the legislation or the target has been passed, and so that's that. But the Tasmanian government, the minister has said they're not going to commission the wind and enter into off-take wind contracts unless they've got an export market for it. Of course, you're not going to double your production in Tas and not be able to export it. That would just sink your existing power system. And of course the wind farms are not going to go merchant and say, well, we'll build anyway. Of course they wouldn't do that. So no, wind and Marinus and HydroTAS upgrading goes as a package. They're all the costs. Those are the costs to be set against the benefits, and I'm afraid EMO's made an error there too.
So what you're actually saying is that the Australian Energy Market Operator has said that the cost of building new wind in Tasmania is zero in their calculations. The cost of building it in South Australia or Victoria is so many billion, and therefore, because it's nothing in Tasmania, billions in Victoria, Marinus is economic. When in fact, from what you've said, and even the Tasmanian Minister has said, these things won't be built unless Marinus is there. So the market operator has got a case to answer here. They've put out an integrated system plan based on a fundamental economic error.
Yes, I think that's true. I don't think it's an academic argument. I think it's quite clear. Wind in Tasmania and the cable comes as a package. But EMO made another error, if I may. In comparing the benefits of Marinus, they said, what's the alternative to Marinus plus wind? And they excluded the cost of the wind, as we've said. They said it's building gas in Victoria. But of course that's not going to happen. So they've overstated the benefits and they've understated the costs. And when you do that, the net benefit looks favourable to Marinus, but you need to fix just one of those, and I'm afraid it's not beneficial. And when you fix both of them, it's very much not beneficial. So I'm afraid it's rather cut and dried.
So the way it's figuring, the Tasmanian Hydro is taking on $2.5 billion to upgrade the system. It's going to have to be taking on subsidies to power purchase agreements in order to make the wind viable. It's going to be relying on somebody to pay for the new transmission that goes through. So all of those costs will have to translate into how higher power prices in Tasmania. Now this is a really critical issue for us because power prices is a killer for a lot of families. So just to go to this issue of the cost of energy, Tasmania joined the national electricity market, and Tasmanians now realise with the recent gas crisis of what that actually means. It means higher prices. How come Tasmanian prices didn't go up as much as they theoretically ought to have done in the midst of the gas crisis?
So we can see from the spot market data that when Tasmania has been interconnected to the NEM seamlessly through Basslink, i.e. when it's running flat out, the Tasmanian price and the Vic price is strongly linked. When the market was basically set aside by EMO around mid-June, the Tasmania interconnector was opened and you saw straight away price separation. Tasmania prices came down strongly. I'm afraid Tasmania backed the wrong horse when they joined the NEM. The adage, when in a hole, stop digging comes to mind. I'm afraid they haven't stopped digging. They're adding insult to injury. Quite why they're doing this, I don't know. But really, they seriously need to think again.
So, in other words, when the market operator suspended the market because it was out of control and people were price gouging, at that point it enabled Tasmania to disconnect from the market, and immediately our power prices went down, and as soon as they reconnected us to the market, the power prices went up again, which
Indeed.
just says that with Marinus there will be no option for disconnecting from the NEM because a whole lot of contracts will be locked into using that cable. So we won't have that option, and that means our power prices will go up by being part of the NEM, plus to pay for the $2.5 billion for the reconfiguration of the hydro and whatever percent of Marinus we have to pay.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes. So I think it's fair to say at this point in time, HydroTAS has an advantage to the NEM because the NEM is fossil based. It's expensive coal and gas. That coal is going and the gas is going, and you're going to have wind and solar in the NEM, hopefully sooner rather than later, but we can expect a dominance of wind and solar in the NEM within a decade. At that point, Tasmania has no advantage. So it's always been the case that Tasmania had an energy advantage through the exploitation of hydro. it sacrificed it. It threw it away through Basslink. And I'm afraid it has no advantage in future in a decarbonised world. It had that advantage, but sadly it's lost it.
So the time frames here, they say they're going to make a final investment decision in 2024 with the idea that the first cable would come on, I think, in 2027 or 28, and then the second one after that. What you're saying by then, the end of the decade, the transition out of coal and gas will have accelerated. And just as it's coming on is the time when it'll have no serious advantage.
Yeah, that structural advantage it has by virtue of the hydro loses value when you move away from a thermally coal-based system. Right now, there is an advantage, but at the expense of Tas energy users. So it's a higher income to Tas, still having to pay for Basslink, however, which we know after paying for it still doesn't work. So that's the present point economics. On the future economics, it's a clean energy system, and Hydro Tasmania does not have an advantage in that system.
So just finally, Bruce, if you were heading up Hydro Tasmania, just speculating on that for a moment, and the Minister said to you, tell me, is this going to make a profit? We're going to have to pay out $2.5 billion to reconfigure the system. We're going to have to subsidise all this new wind. We've got to build new transmission, and that's going to take out a whole lot of biodiversity and forests and wetlands and Robbins Island and so on. Can you swear to me that this is going to make money? What advice would you have, given your analysis? What would you have if you were head of the hydro? Would you say it's going to break us, or what would you say?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that there is not an underlying economic advantage, and if you spend all that money, you are damning the hydro to a future of no profitability or very weak profitability, likely none. Having a begging bowl out to the government for the future, I'd be leaving a mess for the future operators and owners of the system. I probably wouldn't take the job if it was offered to me that would have to be, how my thoughts went. But I think in all honesty, a CEO and a board ought to be thinking very carefully about it, because they'll be damning themselves to a loss-making future, which is not a nice place to be if you're a government corporation.
And not a great place to be as a Tasmanian energy consumer, looking at what that means, because apart from power bills, the hydro has been paying dividends into the state budget, which enables the funding of schools and hospitals and so on. It just adds the hydro to the list of debtors rather than to a corporation that can actually contribute. Thanks very much, Bruce.
Thank you.
That's great.